Right, so today what we're going to do is kind of give you an overview of the mechanism of natural selection in general, just so you know how it works. Um, and then tomorrow in our notes, we'll look at the Hardy-Weinberg equation very specifically. Okay, so today, let's just take a look, first of all, at what happened before Charles Darwin. Okay, because it's important to understand that natural selection didn't take place in a vacuum. The concept didn't come about in a vacuum. It's not an edict that Darwin passed down from a high mountaintop. It's got some scientific basis behind it. And there were some ideas that floated around before Darwin that are helpful to note here. So, first of all, Aristotle thought about species being grouped together with similar affinities. In other words, they had specific characteristics that allowed them to be grouped together. And he called this scala naturae, and he had this idea that everything on this scala was in like a ladder. It was a sort of hierarchical organization of organisms with, of course, humans at the top, and the lowliest of bacteria, or, well, maybe not bacteria because it was Aristotle, but the lowliest of organisms at the bottom. And Aristotle had this idea that things were striving to develop and move their way up this scala naturae to become human. Which was the pinnacle of natural selection. None of those things are obviously true. Humans are definitely not the pinnacle of natural selection. All you have to do is think about every knee injury you've ever had, and you start to see how natural selection is not perfect, right? The knee did not pan out very well in natural selection. So human knees aren't the greatest. So humans really are not the best of the best in terms of natural selection. But we can kind of talk about that as we go. But essentially, it's more about organisms developing certain adaptations to fit certain situations, right? So also Linnaeus, Carl von Linné, who changed his name to Linnaeus, did classification, and he came up with this binomial nomenclature system for naming organisms. And he classified organisms based on physical similarity. And again, this classifying and grouping things based on similarity kind of indicates that there's some sort of common ancestry behind them, right? That's the underlying assumption behind all of that grouping. French scientist named Cuvier noted that fossils of species differed significantly from more modern forms of the same species. So you can look at a modern day sloth, and we all love to because they're cute, right? But then if you look at the ancestors of modern day sloths, they were like 9 feet tall, those giant sloths that look kind of scary, actually. If you ever look at them, they're huge and ginormous and scary. Also, Cuvier proposed this idea of catastrophism, that changes happen only because of gradual events in nature. There's no such thing as a gradual change. And then, of course, there's good old Lamarck, right? We all know about Lamarck. Lamarck was the guy that said that if you use a body part, it would develop, and that you would pass on that more developed body part to your offspring. If you didn't use it, it would sort of atrophy and fall away, and it wouldn't be passed on to your offspring. In other words, this idea of acquired traits that you acquire during your lifetime would be passed on to your offspring, which, if that were true, if your mama had pierced ears before you were born, then you should have been born with pierced ears, right? If your daddy has a tattoo on his arm, then you should have been born with the same tattoo, and that's not really the case, right? There was also a guy named Malthus. He was more of a social scientist kind of guy, who talked about the fact that there were population limits, that populations were limited by the food supply. He did this in a not very nice way, but he was kind of arguing against what we would call today entitlement programs like welfare to help out the poor and destitute. But basically what Malthus said is that, look, populations they're limited in how big they can get because they only have certain resources that they can use. And once they outstrip those resources, they can't continue to grow. So All of these ideas are floating around. These are other people's ideas that are floating around in Darwin's head, right? He was also an avid pigeon breeder. So he bred pigeons and showed them. And so he was able to actually breed certain traits into pigeons. So he saw that traits could be bred into organisms. We now know that's artificial selection. That's what we call it. But anyway, it still gives you the idea that traits are heritable and that you can select for certain traits by breeding certain individuals together. Um, and then also, besides thinking about how species change, Darwin was also kind of an amateur geologist, and he read the works of Hutton and Lyell, who both proposed that geologic features were the result of gradual changes that are occurring over time. And in fact, Lyell called this uniformitarianism, that the mechanisms of change of the planet are uniform over time. Now, we understand plate tectonics now, that the planet wasn't always in the continents and shapes and countries that we see today, that over time, continents move because the plates that they're sitting on move, right? And Hutton and Lyell were the first to kind of propose that, although the idea of plate tectonics is a much more recent idea. But the idea that the environment in which organisms changed is important. So Darwin had all of these things floating in his head at the onset of him thinking about natural selection. Okay, so here's that scala naturae, right? The idea that the simplest are striving to become the greatest, right? And again, humans are at the top of the scala naturae. All right. So we kind of talked a lot about those ideas in baby bio, right? But just to remind you, those are things that influence Darwin's thinking. So Darwin gets engaged. He goes on a trip for 5 years around the Earth on a ship, the HMS Beagle, which was a cartography ship. So it was trying to map some trade routes. But he was sent as a naturalist on this particular voyage. And he did a lot of observing, he did a lot of collecting, and then he came home and he donated a lot of stuff to museums in the area, but then he also kept a pretty extensive collection of specimen that he collected while he was away for himself. And he sat in his den and he smoked on his pipe and fathered children and, was a husband and had friends coming over and all of those things. But over time, he kind of mulled over this idea that he later called descent with modification. Okay, this is the idea of natural selection, and I think that's a really great way of putting it, right? The natural selection was not Darwin's term. His friend Thomas Henry Huxley, who was kind of his public voice when Darwin published On the Origin of Species, actually called it natural selection. Okay. But I think it makes more sense. As organisms descend, they get modified, right? And that is a great way of describing how natural selection works, right? Darwin's main focus was on adaptation. So adaptation allowed certain species to survive better in their environment, right? And Darwin's finches are a great example of this. They had beaks that were adapted to their food source, so if you had a seed-eating bird, that bird would have a stout, heavy beak for cracking open those seeds. If you had maybe a nectar-eating bird, they would have a long, slender, delicate beak for getting down into flowers, and so on. They were just adapted for the food supply that they were trying to exploit. I'm sorry. I'm just going to pause while that's the problem with recording these at school. All right. So recall also that Darwin did not come up with natural selection. While he did it independently, he was not the only one who came up with the idea of natural selection. Another guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, actually a little later on, while Darwin was home pondering his evidence, Wallace wrote a letter to Huxley saying, "Hey, I have this great idea. What do you think of it?" And it's the exact same idea that Darwin was telling his friend Huxley he had. And so because Wallace was not wealthy and not able to publish his work right away, Darwin was able to get in there, publish first, and get credit for the ideas. But actually, Wallace had the same idea. as Darwin on this descent with modification. All right, so let's talk about what Darwin actually saw, what he inferred, right? And then some things that we need to keep in mind about natural selection. The first thing are his observations, right? Members of a population will vary greatly in their traits, right? So organisms in a population look different from one another. They have the same traits, but the traits might be varied in some way, right? Like skin color in humans, eye color, hair texture, all of those things. We all have those traits, but there are differences between individuals within the population. Traits are inherited from parents to offspring. Doesn't sound all that revolutionary, but remember that Darwin did his work before Gregor Mendel's work was discovered. Mendel had actually done his work with inheritance, but it wasn't published. And so Darwin did not know exactly the mechanism for how this all worked. And in fact, any mistakes that Darwin made in On the Origin of Species had to do with inheritance because he didn't have access to Mendel's work. Darwin also noted that all species are capable of outproducing their environmental resources. And because of that, a lot of the offspring don't survive, right? So there's differential survival. The inferences then that he made, and this really is a summary of how natural selection works. If all of those observations at the top are true, then he was able to infer that individuals whose inherited traits give them higher probability of surviving and reproducing, and that's the key, it's the reproduction, right? In order for traits to flourish in a population, they have to be spread on to multiple individuals in the population. The only way to do that is to have them be passed from parents to offspring. So it's not just about survival, it's also about increasing the likelihood of reproduction or increasing the likelihood that they're going to reproduce more often. That's called having greater reproductive success. So individuals who have the best traits are going to survive, reproduce better, and this inequality means that favorable traits over time will accumulate in populations over the course of multiple generations. The things that we need to keep in mind is that it's about the population, not the individual, right? You're born with the traits that you have. They're either good or they're bad. You got to make the best of whatever it is that you've got, right? You can't evolve new traits during your lifetime. Over time, the whole population can evolve through multiple generations of reproduction, right? The traits that are influenced by natural selection must be heritable. Okay, so we're not talking about social constructs here, right? You can't use natural selection to explain, belief in a higher being or something like that. That's more of a thing that comes from someplace else. It's not a genetic trait to believe in a higher being, right? That comes from our socialization. And so that's not something you're going to see influenced by natural selection. Excuse me. The other thing you have to remember is there's no perfect environment, right? Environments go through changes all the time. So they're kind of a moving target, and the organisms are trying to hit the perfectly adapted state in an environment, but that's really hard because the environment is constantly changing. So there's no such thing as perfect, and what's good in one population isn't necessarily good in another population that lives in a different environment. All right, so there are some things that we can observe about natural selection, right? These are directly observable evidences of natural selection. And, again, we kind of think of this as something you can't see happening, but you actually can see in some instances this happening. So, for example, you've got predation and coloration in guppies. Pools of guppies with high predation produce drab-colored males, right? Whereas if you have populations that don't have high predation, then the males are brightly colored, right? And there are numerous examples of natural experiments that occur where you have a species that's in one environment versus a species in another, and you can compare how natural selection has shaped those organisms over time. That's why we call it a natural experiment. Nature set it up for us. You can also see drug resistance evolving in bacteria and viruses, right? Some viruses and bacteria will always be resistant to the medications we use, right? But only a very small percentage of them. But over time, when you treat an illness with a particular drug, what happens is it increases the instance of antibiotic resistant bacteria and viruses, right? And we kind of just talked about that just a little bit when we talked about mechanisms by which bacteria can get new pieces of DNA. You can also see the fossil record, right? And while the fossil record is not complete, admittedly, right, there are some big holes in it. You can definitely see some evolutionary trends going on where organisms are changing, and you can see some orderly changes happening over time. You can see similar patterns in fetal development. There's homology where the same structure that's used for a similar function in different groups of organisms indicates that they have a common ancestor. That's called homology. And then there are vestigial structures that, like your appendix, that appeared to have a bigger function at some other time in our history, seem to not have much of a function at all, right? So you have an appendix, which hints at an evolutionary history, but now your appendix doesn't really do much. And so scientists wonder why it was even there in the first place. You can also have biogeography, so you can look at what we think happened to the geographic features of the planet and use that to explain how species are distributed in various places. So you can kind of do the jigsaw puzzle with the planet and fit Pangea back together, or look at where there were land bridges at various points in history and see different groups of organisms and how they might have migrated and changed along the way. That also helps us to think about where we can find. And then, of course, we have molecular similarity. And we've talked about this before. If you have the same sequence of DNA, right, that indicates that that sequence must have come from a common ancestor. Also, same sequence of amino acids in the proteins, right? And essentially, this is one of those frozen accidents that we get. All organisms are composed, all of their proteins are composed of the same 20 amino acids, right? The nucleic acids are formed from the same 5 nucleotide bases, right? There are others out there that could have been used, but for whatever reason, all life forms use all of those things. So that indicates that there was some sort of common ancestor that we all derive from. If you go back far enough in our history, we all had a common ancestor, is what that tends to indicate. All right, so there's drug resistance, right? You have this large population. And then some of them have this specific gene, right, that allows them to be resistant to specific antibiotics. When you treat the organism, the person who's sick with those antibiotics, the drug-resistant mutants proliferate, right? And the ones that are not drug-resistant die out. And over time, you get more and more individuals who are drug-resistant. So the population as a whole becomes more drug-resistant. Okay, here are fossils. Here's the 4-limb picture I was talking about. So turtles, humans, horses, birds, bats, seals. Notice the same bones are present in the 4 limbs of each. While there might be a slightly different use for each of them, but the same bones are there. Okay, so you can see that kind of indicates a physical similarity that indicates a common ancestor. Here is fetal development. Notice how similar the chick, the human, and the house cat looks at a very early stage in fetal development. And then some vestigial traits, right? We have a tailbone, but we don't have a tail, right? But our nearest relatives, not ancestors, do have tails, right? Or not our very nearest, but pretty near. Also, goosebumps are a vestigial trait, right? If you've ever had flash anger, I don't know if you've ever felt that tingling when you get really mad really fast, your hair is standing up, right? And in our relatives, that standing up of hair is an emotional display, but it also makes the organism look bigger. That chimp looks bigger than it actually is because its hair is all bristled up. And it's a signal to stay back. I'm big, mean, and scary. You don't want to mess with me. I'm too tough for you, right? We've retained the ability to have those goosebumps. It also can act as an insulator as well. So when it gets cold, you can ruffle up our relatives could rustle up that puff up their hair and trap air spaces close to the body. That's why when you get cold, you get goosebumps as well. And then, of course, you can see this is an amino acid sequence, and you can see you can compare amino acid sequences, and we're going to be doing that as one of our major labs, right? And looking at amino acids that are different between different groups of organisms, and you can see how over time, just based on the number of changes in amino acids, how far back the organisms diverge from